That I'm very thrilled to be able to support Malaprop's Bookstore and UNC Press and great scholarship tonight by virtue of providing an introduction to our primary guests tonight, Mark Simpson-Vos and Bart Elmore. Mark Simpson-Vos is the UNC Press's Wyndham Robertson editorial director. This is a daily reminder to him of Wyndham's exceptional life and career, as well as her generosity, and by extension, the vision and generosity of those who have supported UNC Press for the last 100 years. Mark wants you to know that he proudly shops at Malaprop's every time he's in Asheville, and that no visit would be complete without time in one of the best independent bookstores in the nation. Thank you, Mark. Bart Elmore, our author tonight, is Associate Professor of Environmental History and core faculty member of the Sustainability Institute at The Ohio State University. Bart is a recipient of the 2022 Dan David Prize, the largest history prize in the world. It recognizes outstanding scholarship that illuminates the past and seeks to anchor public discourse in a deeper understanding of history. In addition to his latest work, Country Capitalism, Bart is also the award-winning author of two books, Citizen Coke, The Making of Coca-Cola Capitalism, and Seed Money, Monsanto's Past and Our Future and Our Food Future. He currently edits Histories of Capitalism and the Environmental Book Series at West Virginia University Press. Bart wants to add that Western North Carolina is a kind of second home for him. He grew up paddling in the region on the rivers and streams in and around Asheville, and he has always considered the region the most beautiful place on earth. Bart tells me that to share time with the good people of Western North Carolina and to talk about his book is a dream come true. So without further ado, Mark Simpson-Vos and Bart Elmore, thank you.
Smithson, thanks so much for that generous introduction. It is really great to be here with folks that I regard as friends, and that includes the fine folks at Malaprop's Books. I'm grateful for Stephanie and Patricia and the other staff there that do such amazing work in connecting books and authors with their readers. I'm not lying. It is one of my absolute favorite bookstores in the world, and it is an absolute gem. So it's delightful to be able to do this tonight with Malaprop's, but also with somebody that is a good friend as well as an author. Bart, it's great to be with you tonight. I guess we'll have to spare folks too much of our usual banter about college basketball and whether UVA is going to be up compared to UNC. We probably would be better, both of us, sweeping that under the rug tonight and talking a little bit about books instead. So I think that coming to y'all from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Bart, why don't we tell folks where you're coming from tonight?
Yeah, Columbus, Ohio. And I also just want to say to Stephanie, to Smithson, to Patricia, to Mark for coming out to the UNC Press. The thing you don't realize when you write a book for the first time is that the real joy of it is doing this, is getting to be with friends, getting to meet new friends, and to have the support of people that you really love and care about. And I know there's some family out there too, so shout out to folks in California and other parts of the country. This is a gift. It's a gift to be here with you all tonight. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this. And yeah, it's a balmy 80-something degrees here in Columbus, Ohio, which is not always the case. So sunny and warm, and it's been we'll see what the evening holds.
Yeah, well, send some of that down our way. We've had 3 or 4 straight days of rain and clouds here, but our heat is no doubt coming. So
right.
Well, so Bart, we could start in all kinds of places, but I'm thinking a little bit about the number of years we've known each other, and that when we first met, we actually started talking about the genesis of this book or what became this book. But at the time, you were already writing your first book, and then we've been in touch as you've written your second book, and this is your third. And so we've got Citizen Coke, we've got Seed Money. Now in Country Capitalism, we've firmly established that you like a 2-word witty title and a good subtitle afterward. But I wonder if we could start with just how you see this new book growing out of the work that you've done up to this point, and what you see its points of relation as being with those earlier books.
Yeah, I think, it's worth me acknowledging something else. To Malaprop's, these bookstores are more than just a bookstore, and another thank you to just providing these spaces for these conversations. But I should also go back to UNC Press. When we first met, Mark, we won't go into the basketball tales, but you took a young scholar who knew nothing about the publishing world, and you sat down at this conference table, and you sat with me for what felt like hours in a good way, and we talked about how this all works. And I can't thank you enough for that, because it set me on a course to, I think, figure out how we can use history to make a difference in the world, and you were somebody that really believed in that. I think UNC Press believes in that. I frankly think you've said this is one of the best bookstores in the world. I think UNC Press is clearly a world leader in this type of work. So I remember putting a pin in it then. I was like, I want to come and work with Mark. And we talked about this. I want to do a book. We want to do a book together. And we did it. And I think, over the course of those years, I had changed so much. I'd gone to the University of Virginia to study the history of the American South and to write about public school teachers. I think even when we first met, I was kind of coming out of that. I even had a dissertation idea at the time, which I'm reminded of now, which was to write an environmental history of Southern rock and roll, which I still think is a good book if someone wants to go out and write that. And I even wrote an article that looked at the Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner and tried to think about, how do these bands from the South, why are they Southern rock? What does it make? What is it about them? And I think the environment actually matters there. But I was kind of searching for what I wanted to do. And I landed on Coca-Cola in part because one of my advisors, Grace Hale at UVA, had a Coke on her desk. And it turns out that she also went to my high school in Atlanta, which was weird. We didn't know that until we started talking about Coke, and we made this connection. And we both thought, okay, here's a story to tell. You're interested in environmental history, which was this field I had just found in grad school, a field that looks at the relationship between humans and the natural environment, both the ways in which nature can be changed by humans, but also the way that tornadoes and disease and hurricanes shapes the course of human events. I was hooked. And yet I wanted to do something that would be, relevant to our time. And Coke struck me as a great project. And so I sat down and wrote that book on the history of Coca-Cola, looking at each of the ingredients in the so-called secret formula and kind of traveling around the world to tell that story. And I think, to answer your question, Mark, what I learned through that journey was that this was difficult to write about corporations that, unlike a lot of historical societies, will say, hey, look, we got all these documents, go check them out. This company was like actually combative, and would write things. I would write op-eds. They would, go back and forth. And so I think I learned how to engage with these large multinational firms, and do so, I hope, in a way that was that gave the full range of human emotions to the people that I was going to write about, trying to tell stories that aren't filled with modifiers and adjectives, the greedy corporation, but actually get to know people inside the company. So I think that the second book on Monsanto and the book that we worked on together reflects that evolution of learning how to get inside companies, learning how to listen a little bit better, and thereby get access that allows you to tell much more interesting stories than maybe you can just find in the archives.
Yeah. I remember even in that earliest conversation, I do remember that you were kind of coming out of your interest in one set of concerns, and that you were moving into the Coca-Cola work, and that you had narrated for me one of the most mind-blowing stories about how the different elements of Coca-Cola had moved and been sourced, and where all those things came from. And it was a way of thinking that really blew my mind too, in the way that you describe how it kind of blew your mind coming into this environmental history perspective. But so you're also a business historian. You've written a lot about big businesses. And I remember that our conversation then was, well, what would it look like to write an environmental history of Southern businesses? But I don't know that either of us really knew what businesses we were going to talk about, or what you were going to write about. And I wonder, as you got into the research, were you surprised to see, and I guess we should probably tell folks in the audience, maybe who aren't as familiar yet with the book, but this is a history that's looking at a series of major corporations that are rooted in the South, but have become really the kind of leading indicators, the leading creators of the modern kind of global economy. So we're talking about Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola and Walmart and Bank of America And who am I forgetting, Bart?
Bank of America, FedEx. Yeah.
FedEx.
Exactly.
And so these are enormous corporations. Everyone would recognize that they're influential. Would everybody have recognized that they had common Southern roots? And did that come as a surprise to you as you started to think that through? And what do you make of those Southern roots? I mean, what is it that these businesses have in common that connects them to the South?
I guess I'd have to start with just the fact that, especially for family that are listening, this is like, this was the book I was meant to write when I first got to grad school. It just took me 20 years or so to figure out how to do it. Because I will say that growing up in Atlanta in the 1990s, this was the world I saw. I would drive to my high school down through, the middle of town, often in terrible traffic. By the way, the environmentalism is probably sparked there, seeing smog alerts in the 90s, which, and it's Orange Day and a Red Day. So, I mean, I think that's where I started getting this. And honestly, Western North Carolina. I mean, I spent most of my time up in the Nantahala, up around Asheville and the Broad, paddling. And so I had these tale of two worlds. I had this big city experience, but I also was out in this environment and seeing this beauty, of the Appalachian Mountains. And I think that contrast, so that was sold, environment was there. But I was watching this story of the South unfold before me in the 90s. The Olympics came in 1996. I'd pass by the French fry box that was the Olympic flame. It looked terrible, but, it signaled that we were this global enterprise. And, I drive by the Coca-Cola. I'm just doing it in my mind. The Coca-Cola headquarters over there, CNN, we're the world leader in news. This was the stuff I was also being kind of preached to as well. There's a lot about the advertising in this book as well. And then, get to my school at Hartsfield International Airport, the busiest airport in the world, with Delta Airlines planes coming in. The company started as a crop dusting firm in the Mississippi Delta. I knew that, but, as I talk about this book, I didn't know that. Yeah, it turns out that they started in Monroe, Louisiana, And to me, those stories matter because I went up to school and I did have this sense that the vision that some people had of where I was from was very much like maybe infused with, oh, brother, where art thou? Or something, which is in part true. Agriculture is part of this story, and there's no doubt about it. But I also saw these booming corporations, and I kind of wanted to put those businesses back into the center of Southern economic history. I thought it was important to give these companies their due and to explore them not from a sense of whoa, whoa, rah, 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 the South is great, but to see what they wrought for good and bad. And but I didn't know what I was going to do. I remember when we were kind of talking about this contract, I thought, man, I have no idea what the argument is, and you probably felt that too. But, it's also another sign of a great editor who gives someone the long leash to kind of go out and explore, because I did find over time that there was this incredible connection that I didn't expect. And I wasn't trying to cherry pick corporations. I was trying to look at the biggest, Walmart, the largest corporation in the world, not in retail, the largest corporation in the world. Delta, the largest airline in the world. Goes back and forth every now and then, but when I was writing it, they were the largest. Bank of America, the largest bank in the world. So you got just this incredible series of firms. What united them? And there were little things, but there were also a big argument. But I'll just do some of the littles, and then we can have a conversation about it. Delta Airlines creating the hub and spoke model. I didn't know that. I knew that they had the hub and spoke model of taking in people to Atlanta because I experienced that. I could never get through the security. But it turns out that it was, again, because they were in this location of the South that had more rural and small towns, that the only way they could generate business was by creating that hub and spoke model in 1955 that became the model for most other businesses and airlines. And then FedEx in Memphis, Tennessee, same thing. They took that hub and spoke model and did it for packaging. So surprisingly, these companies, Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, Walmart, FedEx, and Bank of America, they all tie together into this larger thesis and story that evolved. They actually were connected in ways I didn't see coming. So it was fun. That's the best part about writing, is when you start to see things you could never think up. That's what makes I think a good research project. It comes out of the research as opposed to something you've just made happen in your mind.
There really was there was a real journey of discovery, I think, as you went through, and I'm thinking about some of the interim conversations we had along the way. The thing that I think surprised me the most is the extent to which you recognized early that there was something here about why these businesses had started in the South, but then became such a powerful force in the world. And we as people who write and think about the South, we talk about, is the South exceptional or not? But here it's the South really is kind of typical of the rest of the world, isn't it? And you describe that hub and spoke dynamic that typifies Delta, but there's something about that kind of network effect that holds all these companies together and ultimately becomes really valuable in a world that looks a lot like the South in a lot of ways. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you've come to understand that?
Well, I do think I have
typical.
Yeah, I think I have too much of an obsession for alliteration, and I will change my titles from now on with country capitalism. But I do think the title, is one of those titles that is meant to get you right to the core of this book. And I always joke, if you get the book and you don't want to read it, but you want to tell people what's in it, here's the big takeaway. Country capitalism, what stood out to me is that all of these businesses, to your point, were making money by servicing the countryside. We're looking at more remote and often rural communities as an asset, not a liability. And to me, again, when you think about the history of American capitalism, of course, I teach here at Ohio State, I think we think of like Pittsburgh Steel, and we think about New York, the financial center. We think about the big cities when we think about Chicago, maybe even. But it turns out that businesses that were trying to figure out how to get goods, people, and capital to and from these smaller markets really changed our economy. And I'd argue, I now put Amazon economy in quotes. You'll see it in the news all the time, but it kind of drives me wild because I can now see that this point and click, package arrives tomorrow at our door kind of model for how our economy runs was totally built on all of these companies in the South. Jeff Bezos, in his own writing, and I've read a lot of his musings about how he started the company. Where did he go when he starts his business in the 1990s? He flies straight into Bentonville, Arkansas. He reads Sam Walton's biography. He's enamored with the system, and he poaches his distribution team from Walmart. I mean, it's one thing to be on the internet and thinking that you're kind of above the ground level, but you've got to figure out how to get things from here to there. And it turns out that Walmart, it's not just kind of a fuzzy connection, it's a direct connection. I mean, he got his people from there. And the first warehouse he starts, where does he go? Because he wants to find a really good logistics person. He hires his team from FedEx, and so this, as I say in the book, the rural roads through the American South lead to our Amazon economy. I don't think we think of the South as a leader in a logistics revolution that changed the world, as you intimated. But it turns out that it was. And I'd like to think that maybe there's a reason for that it's easier for us, I think, as a society to say, well, that, the South is kind of a backward place, and therefore that's where all of our sins go to die, where Jim Crow was strongest, where all these terrible things were. And that's all true. That history is embedded in the story. But it turns out that the largest corporations were often emerging at the same time as those retrograde social institutions were in existence. And I think that's a lesson for our own time about, if you just build this job or this factory, good things will happen, society will heal. Turns out we have to do the hard work of fixing society, even when we have the jobs and the big businesses. So, I hope that's what's one of the takeaways of the book, because I think it's one that kind of rights a wrong that our textbooks have, which is, and then in the South, and whenever we're in the South, it's cotton or tobacco, and as opposed to thinking about these other ways in which the South influenced our economy.
Yeah. Well, so you've given us the kind of first big move of the book, right? So the first big move is to recognize that the global economy, as we think of it today, really does have its origins substantially in the American South, and in these roads to capitalism that travel through the rural areas of the South and the rest of the world in many cases. So the second big move here is to recognize what the environmental impacts are.
Right.
And, I warned you I'd ask you a little bit of an unfair question, but I'm really curious how you're going to answer it. So, I mean, if you think a lot about environmental change and big scale environmental change, right? And you write about that in a lot of different ways in the book in terms of how those environmental impacts can get quantified in lots of different ways and understood in a lot of different ways. But, if you think about the ways, all of the kind of contributing factors to what we call ecological change in the world, on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you put the South in terms of an influence?
Yeah, I thought about it because it's a good question. I'd say 9, 10. I mean, it's hard to think of a company like Walmart. It's the largest employer in the United States. Its impact and reach in terms of affecting what's going on in China, what's going on in all their manufacturing centers around the world. It's hard to say that the South isn't way up there when it comes to impact. And I think, again, it revolves around logistics. The thing I think that really stood out to me, and I write about this in the introduction, I'm a part of the story as well as anybody. I'm not necessarily pointing fingers and saying, oh, look how terrible these folks are being. A lot of times I'm saying, I expect my package tomorrow from Amazon, even if it's a really complicated thing that needs to come from a plant, thousands of miles away. My expectation is it's going to arrive right away. And yet I think if we're going to have a green economy, we need to kind of wrestle with that a little bit. Our own expectations and also the corporate expectations. But that system would not have been possible but for express delivery systems that FedEx, revolutionized. Be able, and not just to get it to any city, because there were airlines, you can imagine when FedEx was founded in 1971, that could get things to the major cities. But what, again, was so key for Smith was figuring out how to take these things to the small package market, smaller planes, to get to these littler towns, and to get these goods, to really create these veins of the economy into these smaller markets. So all of this became a huge impact. And yet the thing I noticed in the book is that our regulations don't really have a way of addressing that. If you're looking at Walmart, for example, the EPA, it looks at its parking lots, which has a huge footprint, it turns out, from the stormwater drainage that comes off the site. And in fact, they were penalized, one of the largest EPA penalties for the stormwater drainage from their parking lots across the country. And, air quality, all the cars that are going there. But what about all of this package flow that they accelerate by creating this kind of satellite-driven, computer-organized, swift delivery overnight system? How do we start to regulate that? How do we start to control that in a way that shapes our planet? That, to me, became the million-dollar question, to which I do not have the easiest answer. But I think that's where we have to start thinking about change. And the last thing I'll say on this is, I started noticing how the littlest things inside these corporations could have huge environmental impacts. I think Coke is the best example here. I'd written a whole book on Coca-Cola and yet somehow had failed to talk about refrigeration. So I got to do it in this book. And it turns out that refrigeration is the single largest footprint of their greenhouse gas footprint, the single largest contributor to their greenhouse gas emissions. It's about 30 to 35% is just keeping Coke cold. And think about it. You can think about it right now. What corner store could you go to right now? And you could get a cold Coke 24/7, 365 days a year. That model, Robert Woodruff called it within arm's reach of desire. I think they've attained it. We can almost do it. Had huge consequences. We think the coldness, what's the big deal? But keeping Coke cold and available for immediate consumption, that's the thing, became a huge problem for the firm. And I got to talk to the chief sustainability officer in the company who had retired and was willing to talk to me. And I said, hey, have you ever thought about maybe turning off some of those refrigerators? And he said, no, that's anathema to how Coke operates. You should be able to get a cold Coke anytime, anywhere. So little things like keeping Coke cold can have these huge impacts. And yet it also means an opportunity. Could we confront that history, that arm's length of desire mantra, and see huge savings when it comes to these greenhouse gas emissions? I think so. So I think there's low-hanging fruit in this book, hopefully helpful for people working inside companies. And then there's like, hey, this is the meta problem. Like, how do we fuel planes, without burning our planet up? And that I don't have the answer to.
Yeah. One of the things that I've come to really admire about you, Bart, is, for somebody who works as much as you do on environmental history, environmental impacts, you're keenly aware of all of these environmental challenges, and yet you bring a real balance to the storytelling. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking about all the ways in which you were able to get access to some pretty incredible people in writing this book. Not anybody can just pick up the phone and get a meeting with Hugh McCall at Bank of America. And yet somehow you managed to do that. You were able to talk to very high up people in some of these other corporations. And I wonder, do you think, A, I think people would be interested, like, how do you get an interview like that? And B, I wonder, do you think that your knack for being a bit of a bridge builder in terms of being able to see both, opportunities and challenges is part of the reason for that? Or I'm just really curious what you make of that.
I think there's a couple of things I'd say. So the first thing I want to say is writer's tip for anybody out there that's writing about corporations. Something I learned in this book, and I should have learned earlier, it's that corporate email schemes are very, very simple. So Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, who, by the way, creates this FedEx in Memphis, Tennessee, for environmental reasons. Environment always matters in the story. He wants to be far enough south from Chicago so that he's not dealing with all that snow with his hub and spoke airport. He wants to be, have these planes be able to land there, but also wants to be far enough north from the hurricanes and the bad tropical storms from the Gulf. And he also wanted to be not in the big cities on the coast. He wanted to be able to access that small package market. So environment always matters in really wild ways. And so, but I wanted to know more, like, why did you cite it in Memphis? So I just played around with the email schemes at FedEx and did it for a while, got a lot of bounce backs. And then finally one day I just didn't get a bounce back. And then I thought, well, I won't hear it. And sure enough, I got an email from the founder of FedEx. I don't think I even told you that, Mark. That's how I got that interview. But he just wrote me back. And, again, what I've found is that people want to tell their story, and they do believe in what they're doing. Whether there's problems in there or not. And so that's how I got Fred Smith. I will not tell you his email just so that he doesn't get blasted tonight, but I think you could probably figure it out. And it was an interesting conversation. Hugh McCall, I think his story, and this is for folks in North Carolina, this may not be new news, but I think he's someone who's very proud of, what Charlotte has become, and that the bank to him, he might not have said when we were looking out from his office suite, this is my city, but he might as well have, I think there's this sense of kind of I helped make this place what it is. And so I think there was an eagerness to kind of tell that story, so much so that some of the documents that are featured in this book come from his personal papers, which he allowed me to see, that are in the special collections at UNC. And, I think they allowed me to tell a more human story. Again, I think it's easy to look at the banker, especially if you're an environmentalist, to say, okay, here's the problem. But it turns out that the opening line in our conversation was, he said, if you think climate change is not real, then you're an idiot. I believe in it. And I actually think that there could be regulations in the banking industry that help. And I'm like, okay, guess we have common cause here. But I think that was part of it, is just, not being shy like I was, I think, when I was younger, to just knock on doors and also show up, drive to Charlotte, see what happens. And you'll see weird things. Like actually showing up at Hugh McCall's office is an intimidating experience for any writer, because you're surrounded by explosives, or what you think are explosives. They're hand grenades that he has as paperweights all around his room because he's an ex-Marine. And and yet he would tell the most telling and meaningful stories. I'll tell a story, actually, Mark, if it's okay. That's not, that got a little edited in the book. This is the best part about coming to these things. You get the bonus material. He just starts talking about his time in the Marines, and I'm kind of wondering where he's going. That's the other thing, giving your interviewees a long leash to just go, trying not to be so controlling. I think I used to be like, well, here's my question. If I don't get the answer to it, but he's just going back to his Marine days, and I'm thinking, okay, this is because of his interest in, the military, et cetera. By the way, he describes it as being this great experience. I went back and saw his papers at UNC, and these are featured in the book. He hated it when he was there, which, by the way, as a historian, you have to kind of cross-check and say, oh, it was a glorious time, and all this. This is from UNC's special collections. I wish I were home or somewhere as a civilian. It seems I have mastered the art of being completely alone while in a crowd. This does not sound like fun. And if there's any question, a couple of days later, he writes to his mom, I don't know what I will do when I get out of here, but whatever it is, I wish I were doing it now. I hate this place. Now, he's in basic training. I mean, we can understand this, but part of it, I think as a historian, is trying to actually confirm, go back to see what they were like. But right around this time, he's writing this letter. He's in Puerto Rico. He's doing an exercise for an amphibious assault. And he's going to jump out of a helicopter. And I don't know, I think the Wall Street Journal had described him so clearly. I'd done a lot of prep to know him. I'm thinking, okay, I'm getting this bravado story, and he's jumping out of this helicopter. He's an officer, so he has to go first. The idea is he's going to stand and cannonball. He has a scuba tank on his back, and he's going to fall into the ocean and then swim to shore. Well, he jumps out and he realizes the plane's altimeter was messed up. They're way too high. And he's falling at a really fast rate. And he breaks out of his cannonball because he's totally frightened. He's 23 years old. He just graduated from Chapel Hill, and UNC Chapel Hill. And he's going down fast, and he hits the water, and his head flips back and hits the regulator on top of his scuba tank and cracks open his head. And he basically says, and I remember I'm looking up at him at this point, and he's beginning to cry. And he's trembling, and he says, I still think about that moment. He says, these are quotes. I was unconscious. When you're unconscious underwater, you're going to die. I didn't have any oxygen. And I'm still wondering, okay, this is a wild story, and it was a near-death experience. Why is he telling me this? And he says, the blood was just streaming from his head, and that was the only way that other Marines from the helicopter could tell where he was. It was a big ocean, And he says, then in the next moment, another Marine jumped in after me. And then he's kind of lost it. And I'm staring at this banker who's probably been the biggest name in banking in Charlotte and really world history. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And he kind of blurts it out. He says he was a black man. And for the first time, I hadn't come in to talk about Jim Crow with him. I'd come in to talk about environmental issues and everything else. But he opened up a conversation about how that was the first moment in his life as a white Southerner from North Carolina, actually South Carolina, he'd ever thought about that and thought about like his, where his position was in society. And kind of it began a journey for him that he reflected in the rest of the conversation about how he might use a bank to do social goods. Now, he didn't achieve all that, and you'll see that in the book. But again, these are the moments I tried to capture because he's right. I mean, one of the things he says is that, but for the Jim Crow segregation being dismantled in the 1960s, this bank wouldn't exist because it required that civil rights movement to open up investment in the South to make all this possible. And of course, I confirmed that with statistics. If you look at retail sales, income, investment, all those things changed after 63, 64 in Charlotte and the larger North Carolina area. You had to lift what Ed Ayers has called the moral tariff of segregation to make any of this possible. So, but I wouldn't have gotten those stories, Mark, if I'd been younger, because I would have come in and said, hey, this is my agenda, instead of sitting back and letting him tell stories and then finding things that I think were more important to feature in some ways in the book than I had originally planned.
I couldn't have imagined when I was thinking about asking you this question, Bart, that you would do such a perfect job of helping our audience tonight know what they're going to get in this book, right? So you're dealing with, again, big corporations, big forces, big decisions, but also there's a real intimacy to it. There's a real human scale to it. And I think that's, for people that are really interested in the history and the kind of present of how businesses work, it's going to be a lot for them in this book. For people that want to think about how the way we do business and the way that businesses work as a part of everyday life have an impact that sometimes we might not think about or see, there's something for them in this book. But actually, I wasn't planning to do this, but I wonder in the few minutes that we have left before we open things up to questions and answers, I'm thinking about the human scale introduction to this book and the way in which you were really thinking about your own place in this story as you were wrapping it up and getting ready to turn it over to me. And you told a very personal story in the book's introduction. And I'm going to let you tell that story because you're going to be able to tell it far better than I can. But I wonder if in telling it, you could talk a little bit about how you came to view the kind of bigness of this topic, but also the humanness of it, and and where do you think it leads us? Writing a book like this or reading a book like this, what do you think the impact is going to be as people get into it?
I don't know. I will tell the story, but I wanted to say one other thing that's kind of related to what you're saying. I mean, I don't know what the big takeaways are. I think when you write this, you hope that people inside the firms, to be honest with you, read it. And that happened with the last book. Right before we came on, I told you that I'd written a book on Monsanto. And when that book came out, I didn't know what was going to happen. I had kind of had a wild journey, ended up on Joe Rogan and among other things. But what that did was just kind of, it allowed for this conversation to kind of go and I think capture the attention a little bit of people inside the firm. So I get this email from basically the owner of Monsanto, the company that I've written about, Bayer. And I didn't know what was going to happen. Is this a good email or a bad email? And it was a very human email. It was from the senior vice president of the company. He said, "Look, I've read your book. Congratulations," which was not something I was expecting to read. This is very difficult for us to read, but I've learned a lot, and I'd love to chat. And I get that this is awkward and weird. He literally says this, and he says, "But you decide. And if you'd like to chat, I'd love to." And I think years ago, I would have, I don't know, I would have seen corporations as black boxes, but instead, I now had gotten to learn that the senior vice president might be sincere. And while people are listening to this, are probably saying, "Oh no, you're getting duped, you're getting co-opted." I spent a year and a half just talking with this person. We did a lot of it off the record. So there's no images or anything. It's just us getting to know each other. And, I came to learn that there are people in these firms who want to do the right thing and who are acknowledging the things that I wrote about, that I didn't pull any punches, that were wrong inside the company. And yet, Mark, here we are 2 years later. And after that conversation today, he said, "I'm impatient," he says, "Yeah, I'm impatient too." And yet one wonders what the impact of this book will be. One guy who comes to mind is that's in this book is the former chief sustainability officer for Coca-Cola, Jeff Seabright, who did not talk to me when I wrote my first book, but did in this book. And I'll tell you, at the end of that interview, he said something to the effect of, "Yikes." And I remember thinking, "Oh no, he's going to, pull back his on the record decision." But he decided not to do that. He said, "Just be careful, because there's stuff in this, and it's in the book, that is tough." And I remember, Mark, you and I had a conversation over the phone about, and by the way, another plug for good editors who can go through the moral decisions with you and think through, is the public good worth the potential personal issues a person can face for talking on the record for something? And I felt like we ended on the right side of things there. But, will the next chief sustainability officer read this and think about this as an opportunity for change? I would hope so. Because back to the story, when I went off to college, and for family members who are listening, they'll know this, I wanted to change the world. I was that kind of kid. I wanted to, I think even when I went to grad school, one advisor who did not take me, which tells you what they thought of this line, said, "I think you have a messianic complex." I remember thinking, that sounds bad, but there's also I want to do good. I've wrestled with the negative sides of what he was saying, and I think, but I went to study biochem and do medicine. I thought that was the best way we could help society, and yet I came to recognize the power of history, that everyone uses history every single day. They do it to get bills passed. They do it to decide what, drugs to use or vaccines. How do we know from the history of this? It's got incredible power to do good in the world. And so I was hooked and switched. And I think the personal story too, for me, was I had left my home, to go far away to New Hampshire, which was about as far as you go. My brother went to Alaska. So, he probably did better than me, but I thought it was about as far as I could get, just to get a new perspective. And it's hard to write about where you're from and to do it critically. It's easier for me to just love where I'm from and then say bad things about other places. But I think doing the hard work of interrogating who I am and where I came from, makes for a better book, because it's there was a time where I would say Atlanta was the best and let me promote it and see how great it is. And it's harder sometimes to interrogate your own Santa Claus, I guess, And so, I was somewhat reluctant in writing that introduction, but you'll get to see me at a very vulnerable stage, because I was very shy, weirdly, at the time. And people think of me as an extrovert now, but I was very unsure of myself. But I think by studying history, I've become a better husband. I hope I've become a better brother-in-law, father. I think it makes you more vigilant for what you're doing in your own time, because you're a part of this, and makes you a little bit more, reflective. And so I think of this as a gift, this profession, not just because I get to teach and write books with you, Mark, which was a dream, but because I think it makes me, a better person to be around. So I'd like to think so. Hopefully my friends think so too.
Well, Bart, I think we've given folks both a great sense of what's in this book and what's on offer, but also I think they've learned a lot about you as a writer and why you do what you do, and the kind of life that you hope a book like this will have out in the world. So I knew we were in for a good conversation. We can talk for hours, and I hope we do again soon. But I think we need to turn it over to the folks who have been listening to us. So, Patricia, we'll invite you back into the frame, and I know you've been gathering questions from folks.
Well, thank you so much, Mark and Bart. What a wonderful conversation. And as a person who loves history, as a historian, I love any great shout outs to the power and importance of history. So thank you, Bart, for saying that. And thank you, Mark, for shepherding another amazing book in the UNC Press collection. Bart, if we could we talk a little bit or hear from you about your influences? What would be a book or two, or a person or two, or an organization or two that you thought was a model for you as you were thinking about and going through the process of country capitalism? What were your touchstones?
I think it would have to start with grad school and my advisor, Ed Ayers, who was really a luminary in the field of Southern history and understood the field so well. I think he had a book, The Promise of the New South, that really kind of blew my mind when I was younger, because it did kind of what I'm doing for the 20th century, for the 19th century. It said, the South that you think is kind of all a backwater when it comes to the economy was in fact this vibrant place. And it was just this beautiful, beautiful book. He taught me a lot about not using modifiers and adjectives. I don't know if this is his phrase, but I say it as if it was his, to give the full range of human emotions to the people you write about, and like what a sound piece of advice that was. Because, and another writer, Shane Hamilton, I'll give a plug to him, he would go through my earlier stuff and say, Coca-Cola does, Monsanto does. They don't do. Who's the person? Who pulled the trigger? Who made the decision? Dig deeper, get to know the folks, because you'll see that a lot. The company did. The company often didn't. It's either vice president made a choice, somebody made a choice. Who made the choice? So that was really, really important to me, was having someone who trained me. And I think the art, so to speak, of getting the story and listening to the people that you're writing about. He would say, though, that he had an easier job. I don't think that's true. He's written some pretty wild stuff, and the Civil War is not an easy topic, among other things. But because his folks are past, they're not alive. And I think there's something to that. Pretty much every time I write a book, I get anxious, not because I want the book sales to go great, although I do want that to happen for all the bookstores out there. And for me, it's the interviews and wondering whether the people that I did the interviews with feel like I did justice to their conversation. And that means McCall, and that means the bottler or engineer, this person lower down on the totem pole, so to speak, that I also talk to. So I think that's the biggest thing I carry. And there's a little bit of mental health issues with that, that go with that, because the book's never really done. You're always wondering, how was this received? It's always thankful, by the way, when you get texts from people that are like, hey, you got it right. I remember there's one guy in the Monsanto book who I wrote about, and he used the F-bomb, and we went back and forth with my editor on this. I said, should we put this in? And we had this kind of heart to heart. And he said, if you change this, you're changing what he was saying. And he was right. Now, I wouldn't have changed it. We put the ellipse or something like that, but that needed to be in there. And I remember that whole week, people saw me, I was a little shaky. They said, well, are you nervous about the book coming out? I said, in my mind, I was worried about, how is this person going to feel about how I portrayed them when they gave me that really kind of emotional access? And I got an email from this person that night when the book came out, and he said, I didn't know I had a gravelly voice, and I thought I'd made it, like through the gauntlet. So that would, I think, Ed, and that human touch is the best. I've gone on too long, so I'll say one other book. Don Worster, the founder of environmental history, wrote a book about the Dust Bowl, and he just didn't hold back. He said, this is not an environmental disaster just caused by a drought. It was caused by actions. Here's what the actions were. Here's how we could do it differently. Here's how we could farm differently. And I felt inspired to say, wow, history can be that useful. Let's see if I can do something that's half as good. His book is incredible. So
I concur. And someone has asked a question about methods of environmental history, and I wanted to couch that with somebody else that I think was a titan, William Cronin, Changes in the Land for those of us who really care about indigenous peoples and the land and ecology. That's where environmental history and the people, one place, one node of contact. And so if you were going to talk about environmental history and the methods today, this person, this is from Jenny. It sounds like you're doing interviews and looking at archival materials, and I'm wondering how that process works and how you can create such incredible narratives.
Well, I was going to pull Nature's Metropolis off the shelf, Bill Cronin's book, because that was the book I read in grad school that opened my eyes to environmental history. It's about Chicago. I should mention that I think this book is kind of like suggesting that Chicago wasn't the only player in this game, that the South was kind of a logistics center in a way that I think Cronin would appreciate, actually. But yeah, I think the methodology, that's interesting. When I was writing these works when I was an undergraduate, I was so obsessed with like whatever subfield I was in. And I remember talking to Jamie Allison, a graduate student that I was friends with, and I said, is this business history, or is this environmental history, or Southern history? And I was obsessed about this because academia has this kind of siloed way of thinking sometimes. And he said, who cares? And it was so freeing. I remember thinking, oh yeah, just take the best from wherever and and build off that. And the same goes for journalism. There was a time where I used to get comments where say, people, you sound like a journalist, and it would be in the historical corner as a kind of a pejorative. Now I happily say thank you. That again, the cross-pollination with journalists has been super helpful for me too. So I think in terms of my strategy, which I do think it's a blend, it's trying to take, I was a fellow at New America in Washington, D.C., big plug for them, writers for the New Yorker and Washington Post. I was around them. I remember feeling completely out of my league because of their ability to get access and tell these stories and also protect their sources using encrypted phones, all these little techniques that they talk to me about. So I happily say I'm all of the above, and I think that we're better writers when we stop thinking about it as I need to just speak to this audience and this audience alone. What are the things I can pull from biochem? What are the psychology? Let's see how many different things we can kind of fuse into the story. So I think it's unique in that sense. The last thing I'll say is that business and environmental history, surprisingly, appeared on the scene late. There were articles written in the late 1990s that said stuff like, we need to have business historians hanging out with environmental historians. 1999 is the article date. And I was going into grad school in the early 2000s. I read that and thought, Yes. I mean, if we're not writing about big multinational firms who have such power now, so bigger than nation states, we should be. So I'm happy to be a part of that journey of kind of trying to bring these business and environmental historians together. And I think it leads to great insights that we wouldn't have if we just stayed in one area.
Well, Mark, what kind of challenges, if I might could have pivot off of what Bart has said, what kind of challenges does the question of, are you a journalist, or is this more like journalism? Is this business history? Is this environmental history? Or is this a social history? What kind of history is this? What kind of challenges does that present to you? And maybe help pull back the veil a little bit about your process.
Well, so I exist in this world very much between Bart and you all at Malaprops. And Bart, I don't know if I told you about the conversations that we had along the way here about what the primary shelving category for your book was going to be. And, on the one hand, your book lives in the history shelf, and another, it lives in the business section, and you might think of it in the environment and nature section. And so the question, that my good, smart marketing colleagues were asking is, where should it go first? And I said, well, I don't know. I think we might need to let readers decide that. And so, I think that we landed as best we could on some decisions. But yeah, there is a challenge, right? Because people know they're interested in particular kinds of questions. People know they're interested in kinds of stories. And so you want to be able to signal to people, hey, if you're interested in how titans of industry think and work, come for that, but stay for this really surprising insight in how they think about and how their colleagues and their corporations think about environmental sustainability as a part of their business. Mm-hmm. Or if you care about conservation and you want to think about how that works in a world that has such powerful multinational corporations running it, come for a really insightful read on that. So I think it's always a challenge. It's one of the things that as an editor I love the most, right? Is I want to make as many connections to as many possible audiences as I can, and to help my writers do that effectively in the way they frame their books, in the way that they shape their books, and then in how we market and promote them. But that's the act of translation that we have to undertake. And thank goodness we have booksellers who also will just read the books and say, this is great. I don't care what section it's on. You should read this. You can't beat the human intelligence behind that.
Mark, can I just have a quick convo with you on that? I mean, Southern environmental history, we haven't mentioned that. That also was weirdly the history of the environment of the American South, if you can believe it, folks. Like the field really didn't emerge. I mean, late 90s, early 2000s. It's really new, and yet there's just so much to talk about. My hope was that we would go more global with this story of looking outwards from the South, which is something that I felt like the field was looking inwards. Did that fit with what you were seeing, and what are you seeing? And you get a lot of these Southern environmental history things. What's the new wave? And in what ways do you think this engages that?
I think that's a great question, Bart. I do think about it a lot. And what I would say is I think the world is looking for help to explain the big things around us, but to do it in a way that we can attach to, connect to. People need human scale, as big as everything around us seems sometimes. And to me, that's why I always go back to region. I go back to place. Somebody who has worked now and lived in the South for 30 years, but isn't from here, recognizing the ways in which things I've seen here and learned here and experienced here do translate out to other places has been a really powerful thing. And to me, the leading frontier right now is, how do we think about this new global history? How do we recognize these global forces, but find ways to write about them that are accessible and that don't get bogged down in too much minutia, but also don't get lost in all of the big forces that, lead your colleagues to ask, who are the actors here? Who's actually doing this, right? So that's what I love about a book like yours, and where I really try to help lead the conversation, is how can we take some of these big themes, these big ideas, but tether them closely enough to people in place that it gives us something to relate to. And again, I think your book has done a beautiful job of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's great.
So, Bart, as we are reaching the top of the hour, do you already have a plan for another book? Or are you just soaking it all in and enjoying this experience of country capitalism and the response? Where are you now in your next project?
I think the latter for sure. And it's taken me a long time to get here. To anyone who's a graduate student or a writer who's been through the journey, I'll just share that it takes a lot out of you, I think, to do these journeys. And it's not like woe is me. You get to write books and talk to students about it, but carrying people's stories and wondering what the outcomes are going to be, and the contentious nature that can sometimes exist with corporations, has led me to do something I haven't done, I think, since I went to high school, which is just like take a step back and breathe. And I'm actually finding in academia how hard it is to talk to people about that. I'm just breaking. They're like, well, still come to this thing. And I'm like, well, no, like, I don't want to come to the thing. I just want to like take a step back for a second. It's like, no, but you could just come and have coffee. And I'm like, no. I really want to step back. I think we're trained, and this isn't just academia, to just go and to be kind of in that race. But I really feel like the next project's going to mature. I have an idea, but I'm not even going to mention it because I don't want it to get its own life.
We won't tell anybody.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard this before, and what I'm trying to do is just I think it's gonna be a really good project, and I really want to just enjoy the ride. And thankfully, this is a great chance for me to just flip it back. I've had people like Mark in my life. I've had great mentors who've shown me how to be a better writer. I was dyslexic when I grew up. I went to the speech school in Atlanta. I should not be writing books by the accounts of what you see when I was a little kid. And it's taken me a long time to learn how to do these things. So I kind of want to enjoy the next one, and which is a weird thing to say because it's environmental work. And so there's this other side of you that feels compelled to like get it out because these businesses are live, the emissions are happening. But I don't think I'll do a good job unless I kind of regroup. So that's where I'm at, as unsatisfying an answer as that is. And I'm hoping for the a muse to come my way in the next couple of months and years. We'll see what happens.
This may not be quite the quote from Unforgiven, but I remember an interview with Clint Eastwood, and he was talking to Burt Reynolds about some things, and Burt Reynolds was asking Clint Eastwood about a film experience, and he'd gone through a lot, and Clint said, strangely, I'm satisfied.
Yeah. I love it.
That's where I see you.
I would just hope that my readers feel that way. That's the most important thing. So anyway.
Bart, my friend, that's the first and last time you're going to be compared to Clint Eastwood.
I'll take it. Anyway.
I thought it was, there are strange bedfellows in the written word, and I think, and the spoken word too. But it's a delight to have you both, have Smithson as well here. Stephanie behind the scenes. We want to congratulate you and celebrate you, Bart, on Country Capitalism. It's been a pleasure to hear your conversation with Mark Simpson-Vos from UNC Press. And we'll just wait until the big reveal after you've, let's just use a metaphor, laid fallow for a little bit.
I like it. Thank you so much. This, as I said, is a gift, and I will be there in Asheville. So for anybody who wants to reach out or chat, I'm the only Bart at Ohio State, elmore.83@osu.edu. Would love to connect. It's the best part of writing, is getting to talk to people. So thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Smithson. And we wish the audience a lovely evening. Thanks for joining us.